Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 36 of the Future of Work show. Frankly, I'm so delighted we're here. Uh, to be honest, it also marks our 1 year anniversary. So we've been doing this show for a whole year. And if you've been with us, you've seen that we've had some amazing guests. We actually started out the show on June 29th last year with the amazing Dr. Ramya Ranganathan, and we spoke about future of careers, a topic we will actually, in fact, be revisiting fairly soon. So please stay tuned. A especially warm welcome to the almost 500 people who've registered for the live event. We are so delighted to have you with us. And the fact that so many of you have registered is really a testament to the fact that we are entering such interesting times. And we're going to be redesigning the workplace in ways that we haven't necessarily ever experienced before. And therefore, there are so many unanswered questions. Now, before we begin the conversation itself, I wanted to ask you a question, and I'd love it if you could, share your own responses in the chat, because it's going to be amazing to see what different people have experienced over the last year and a half of the pandemic. So if you had three choices, the first being to continue working from home, the second being returning to office, and the third being some kind of flexible hybrid format, which is going to be your preference going ahead? So we'd love to start seeing what some of your responses are. So let me give you a little bit of background about our show itself today. As of course you know, our topic today is the hybrid workplace. And over the last, I would say, 8 or 9 months, there have been so many conversations around what will the workplace look like once the pandemic ends. And one of the things I discovered was that no matter whose research seminar I attended, whether it was a research seminar at MIT or London Business School, the one study that kept getting referenced again and again was a study actually conducted in 2012, 2013 by Stanford Economist Professor Nicholas Bloom. And perhaps the reason this got referenced so often was that, one, there aren't too many studies of this kind. And the questions it sought to address are just so topical and so important for all of us. The second, it's an amazingly well-designed study. So before I bring on Professor Bloom onto the screen, I will share a little bit about the study itself, because while he references it, he doesn't really describe that in much detail. So the study, as I said, it's an experimental study. It was done at an organization called C-Trip, a Chinese travel agency, which wanted to, frankly, test out what happens when you have a large part of the workforce, and that to a call center workforce, working remotely from home. Because back in 2012, 2013, the popular perception was that the moment you have a large number of employees working from home, they will probably slack off. And with nobody to supervise them, productivity will probably fall. So one of the reasons why the study is so interesting is that it asked for volunteers. And then of the 1,000 odd people who volunteered, it divided those 1,000 fairly randomly into two groups. One, which was the experimental group, which actually worked from home 4 days a week and came to office on the 5th. And the other was the control group, which had exactly the same kind of infrastructure, policies, everything else was absolutely constant. And the reason, obviously, this was done was so that any differences that emerged, either in productivity, well-being, promotions, career progression, et cetera, could be traced back to its source. So I will not reveal the conclusions of the study. I will let Professor Bloom do that himself. But that's why the study is so interesting, because it's so well designed. And completely as an aside, sometimes it takes economists to to prove things that, perhaps as HR or organizational professionals, we have a hunch for, but don't necessarily have ways of proving. When I was doing my doctoral studies, in fact, I was quite amazed by the fact that the first absolutely concrete, watertight study that nobody could argue with on the impact of human resource processes on productivity was also designed in the 80s by a pair of econometricians. And just by how watertight the design was, their findings carried so much weight. Professor Bloom also has done subsequent research. As you can imagine, he is sitting on what seems to be a gold mine. So he's done a lot of subsequent research on what organizations have experienced, what employees have experienced, and in January published another paper which had a huge sample size, 22,500 individuals and over 1,000 organizations. So he will also share a little bit about what some of the findings from that study were. Now, before we jump into this, I also have a couple of announcements. And the first is one which gives me great pride. Uncube and Harappa are partnering to bring you a program, Managing the Hybrid Workplace. So in case you aren't aware of Harappa Education, they're an amazing platform helping young professionals and mid-career professionals develop the kinds of skills that they need to be extremely successful. The courses are very well designed, very well researched, and frankly, very, very accessible. So we are really proud that Uncube and Harappa will be jointly offering this program. And as an aside, the people at Harappa are also amazing to work with. Fabulous, fabulous people. So do watch out. And within just a few weeks, that course will be out. The second announcement is that as Uncube, we will be very happy to partner with you as you manage this transition for yourself, whether this be leadership orientation, so that leaders understand the kind of behaviors that they will need to role model for the cultural shift to a hybrid workplace to be successful, or whether it is advice on how to design the hybrid workplace policy, or whether it is all about managing the employee experience. So with those announcements out of the way, let me bring on the conversation with Professor Bloom. And one last bit of trivia. The conversation was actually recorded in March. I had reached out to Professor Bloom in December last year. And after, I would say, quite a bit of following up, he accepted our invite and joined us in March. We had the recording ready and we're just getting so excited about sharing it with all of you. And then the second wave hit. And given that the second wave was so devastating, we just felt that that kind of conversation, did not match the need of the moment. So if you were following Uncubed conversations at that time, they were all about employee well-being, managing stress, managing mental health. So it is now that things are better that we're so happy to bring you this conversation. Just give me a moment. Sorry, I believe there was a sound problem, so I'm going to bring it back with sound. Just give me a moment. So much demand. So for those of you who don't know Professor Bloom, he's the William Ebel Professor in the Department of Economics at Stanford University, a Curtsey Professor at Stanford Business School and Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research, and a co-director of the Productivity, Innovation, and Entrepreneurship Program at the National Bureau of Economic Research. Now, his work on telecommuting has been cited and discussed in the New York Times and Wall Street Journal. So I can't tell you how delighted I am that we're actually able to have this discussion and jump into some of your research. So let me start with the fact that you did the first randomized experiment on the impact of telecommuting. Uh, I'd love to understand a little bit around what is it that motivated you to, start that research, and what were some of your big findings from that?
Sure. I got interested in it because I used to work in McKinsey, the consulting firm. And then after that, I went into academia. I'm a professor at Stanford now and was working a lot on management practices, so how well run firms were, how it determines productivity. In fact, I've been out to India on several trips to work with Accenture and the World Bank out in India. I've done work in the US, the UK. And I got interested in working from home really because it became clear that there's a certain way that you want to run firms to make them more productive and profitable. Like you're going to have performance monitoring and give, good employees promotions and bad employees retraining, and you want to collect data. So most of that's increasingly obvious and everyone agrees on it. The areas of work and management there's much less agreed on is what it's like being nice to people practices, maternity leave, paternity leave, job sharing, working from home. And there's much less consensus on that. And I was very lucky that in 2010, in the back of one of my Stanford classes, oddly enough, there was someone called James Liang, who was the founding CEO and at that point chairman of Ctrip, which was China's largest travel agency. It was worth about $10 billion on NASDAQ. So it's like a massive company. Very Stanford, that oddly this guy was sitting at the back of my class. And they were thinking about introducing working from home in their Shanghai headquarters. So, Shanghai, like London, New York, Mumbai, multiple large cities around the world is so expensive property-wise. They wanted to try and grow, but without increasing their footprint because office space is really expensive. And so entirely for that reason, they were considering working from home, but worried that employees would goof off. So they decided to set it up as an experiment. And I got involved in that and running a large scientific experiment on working from home. And we found that, in fact, working from home led to massive productivity increases, about 13%. So I published that paper a couple of years later. And, obviously the topic was kind of interesting, but not very lively until the pandemic, when interest in working from home completely exploded because everyone is now working from home.
Actually, I found that experiment extremely interesting, not just because it was so well designed, but because of some of the findings. So, the fact that productivity went up. Interestingly enough, we've been doing our own research anecdotally and interviewing business leaders, and pretty much across the board, most companies do report an increase in productivity through the pandemic. And perhaps a year ago, if we'd asked them, we would have got a very, very different response. So, that finding was really interesting. I was also really interested in your finding that attrition fell and the general satisfaction with the workplace increased. And of course,
so there were kind of three big findings, two of which you mentioned, one other I'll go through that's a bit hidden in the paper that's become a huge deal recently. So the three big findings: first, the productivity went up, which was a huge surprise. I have to say, Ctrip's view were their basic business proposition is, look, we'll save a lot of money on office space, but people are going to goof off at home. So they're going to be lazy and watch TV and sleep. And, the joke is the three great enemies of working from home: the bed, the television, and the one of them. So they found actually productivity went up by 13% at home. And the two big factors were, one, it's quieter at home. So people, said, I can concentrate. And there were great stories. My favorite was the person that said, in the office, my office mate in the desk over, she clips her toenails under the desk with like a toenail clipper. And complained it was disgusting. It was horrible. You can't concentrate. So it's quieter in the office. Sorry, it's quieter at home. The other issue is people work more minutes at home. So these were call center workers. So they're making calls. They're on the phone basically all day. And it turns out that at home they really start when they're supposed to start at 9, and they really work through the day. They take less time going to breaks. Lunches are less. Toilet trips even are less. So collectively, productivity is up 13%. So one thing, productivity is up. Second factor, as you mentioned, attrition is well down. So that's also really positive. People really like it and quit rates hard. The third factor that's a bit hidden in the paper, but it's a huge issue now, or will be.
Promotion.
Yeah, promotion. So
Promotion.
these teams were teams of people that those in the office work full time and those at home work 1 day a week in the office and 4 days a week at home. And you saw that for the people working from home, if most of their team members, which they were in this experiment, were working in the office, their promotion rate's almost half. So just to like think about this, it's basically saying if you have a team of 15 people and 3 of them are working at home almost full time and the other 12 are in the office, the 3 at home, their promotion rate's massively down. And the reasons they said is partly they've forgotten about, they're not there. And partly they just don't develop the managerial skills needed to be promoted. So that's the dark side that's come up, that's there, and it's a big issue. I think if we return to the office now and some people go in and others don't, a lot of CEOs and executives worry about that.
No, and rightly so, actually. I mean, even before I read your research on this, a number of HR leaders whom we work with have expressed this concern that as we work into a hybrid model, and particularly if the hybrid isn't evenly distributed, and there are some people who work from office locations far more than others, then they're pretty concerned about what's going to be the impact of the lack of face time and sort of lack of personal mentorship on the careers of those who are working remotely. The other thing I found really interesting, Professor Bloom, about your study was the impact or the shape it sort of took over the months. So would love to hear about, what you found after your 9 months were up. And in this particular experiment, people were asked if they wanted to reconsider.
Yes. Initially, everyone was very enthusiastic. So just to point out, all these people are volunteers. The way they set it up is they asked 1,000 people in 2 divisions who wants to work from home, and roughly half of them said they did. So in itself, that's kind of interesting. So half the people said, no, I don't want to work from home. And the reason they said it was, it's isolating and lonely working from home. I'd like to keep coming in. But of those that said they would work from home, C-Trit them randomized. They literally drew a ping pong ball out of an urn and it said even. So even people got to work from home for the next 9 months, but 4 out of 5 days a week. Even birthday people. So if you're born on the 2nd, the 4th, the 6th, 8th of the month, you were at home for the next 9 months, 4 out of 5 days a week. And if it's odd like me on May the 5th, then you stayed in the office. And what they found is initially, everyone that opted to work from home is really enthusiastic. So this is great. Within, 6 months, particularly by 9 months when the experiment ended, they were beginning to get really depressed and kind of, it's so lonely, it's so isolating, I'm not enjoying this. And so at the end of the 9-month experiment, they let people re-choose. And it turned out that the majority of the experimental group decided to return to the office. And the stories we heard were consistently, it's very lonely, it's very isolating, particularly single younger people. So it's very relevant actually for Asian cities where apartment sizes are quite small. So I've spent a lot of time out in India and, Japan and China. Obviously, you can hear I'm British and I live in America. American and British houses and apartments or flats tend to be larger, spatially. Those in Asia tend to be often a bit smaller because the cities are very expensive. And these are not particularly good environments for young people to be working from home. So I think for younger single people living in small apartments, they don't want to work from home. What we tend to see, they change their minds. They're probably right now, those that are young and single working from home right now, for a year during the pandemic are probably desperate to come back to the office. If you look in the data, I've collected a lot of survey data since. It tends to be older people that are married with children living in houses tend to be a lot happier working from home. Stay with them.
Yeah. And I think in your later studies, particularly the paper that you, I think, published January this year, the large research of 22,500 people, you seem to suggest that there's also an uneven distribution across professions.
Yes. So one of the biggest predictors of whether you can work from home or not, whether you do work from home, is obviously what you do. And so office jobs are typically a very high share of working from home. If you think it's partly professions, partly industries. So if we look, we see tech, high-tech financial services. I live in Silicon Valley, basically, near San Francisco, and around me, there's lots of high-tech workers, and they find it very easy to work from home. Whereas on the other side, if you look at people that tend to work in retail, like face-to-face, working with customers, manufacturing, cleaning, some higher skill jobs, but generally these tend to be lower skill, lower education jobs. They have to come to the office. So it's very much driven by what you do, which tends to relate to, honestly, education and income. So what we've seen under the pandemic is basically wealthier, university graduates have been able to work from home because they tend to do office managerial professional jobs. Less educated, people that left school at, say, 13, 15, 16, are much more likely to have to come in to work every day because literally they have jobs that do not allow them to.
And what's been your experience around young parents?
We see in the data, well, there's two things. Under COVID, it's obviously really hard. So I know the US data, just over half of American employees have children aged 18 or under in the house. And in the US, schools are shut. I don't know the situation in every other country. I know the UK, they're also shut. And that's caused tremendous issues for parents, particularly young parents. I actually have 4 kids. My youngest is 5. And it is not easy. All 4 of them are at home right now because schools are closed. They're doing Zoom school. That it makes life definitely harder. The other question is post-pandemic, when schools reopen, you see in the data that parents of young children prefer to work from home. So people that have kids age 5 or under at home seem more keen to work from home. We just asked them, would you like to work from home, and ask some other data. On average, for people with a university degree, they report about 50% of people say they would like to work from home most days. If you look at those with kids, that goes up to more like 60%. So it increases it. It's not huge. I would say amongst those with the university degree, the typical choice is to work from home 2 to 3 days a week and to come in the office 2 to 3 days a week. So on average, people want to mix. Some, of course, around a quarter of people want to work from home full time, and a quarter never want to work from home, and a half is somewhere in between.
So I'm going to refer to the recent survey study that you did, because I think that's really interesting, and it points to some of what we can expect happening. And I know that your research is based on a US sample, but I think we're seeing a fairly similar trend in the organized sector, at least in India. So I was very curious about one of your observations that employees want more flexibility, perhaps, than organizations are comfortable with at this point.
Yes, so there's a huge choice, and I've talked to so many execs. I should say, where I'm coming to you from in terms of what my information is I've been surveying 2,500 Americans and 2,500 British working age employees, many months going back to the beginning of the pandemic, surveying around 1,000 companies a month in each country, and also talking to a lot of executives, including, in fact, Indian nationals. Like I was talking to Satya Nadella earlier this week of Microsoft, because I'm talking to a lot of tech firms, and many of the senior executives actually, were born in India because of the success of the Indian community in tech in the US. So I've been discussing with a lot of companies about policies, and there's kind of a trade-off. It's a tricky trade-off over how much choice to give employees in terms of working from home post-pandemic. So on one hand, there's the view, and I remember talking to a large high-tech firm here that the CEO, she felt very strongly about this, said, look, we see in the data, people have very different preferences over how many days a week they want to work from home. So I mentioned around a quarter of people want to work from home full-time. They love it. A quarter of people don't want to work from home at all. They want to post-pandemic come in 5 days a week, and the other half are somewhere in between. So she said, look, this is America, this is India, this is Britain. You should let people choose. We're free countries. If people want to work from home 5 days a week, that's great. Let them do it. They'll be happier doing what they want to do. So that's one view, and that was actually even my view about a year ago, at the beginning of the pandemic. On the other hand, is the realization that if you look in the data, who wants to work from home, as we discussed, is not random. It tends to be the preferences to work from home higher with people with young kids, tends to be a bit higher for women, There are other groups that I don't have in our survey here that, for example, people with disabilities, maybe some religious groups, people want to work from home more, people that live further out from the office. And given those working from home, as we discussed earlier, if your colleagues are going into the office is associated with lower promotion rates, I worry if we let people choose, you could find that, say, single young men come into the office 5 days a week, they therefore get promotions, and then 5, 10 years later, the whole firm has, single young men managers. And clearly that's a big issue. So I am actually not in favor of firms letting employees choose, because I worry about this diversity issue and implicitly a discrimination issue, issues with lawsuits. You can imagine what happened 10 years from now, there'll be a huge number of lawsuits, and correctly so. So I would advise against letting employees choose, and instead taking the most popular average option, which is about 2 days a week at home, and running with that for everyone. So just to be very clear, my advice, and actually what's coming increasingly popular, is what's called hybrid work, or it's sometimes called the 3-2 plan, or I've heard it called the Google plan, which is you're in the office 3 days a week, let's say Monday, Tuesday, Thursday. You have all your meetings, your client events, your presentations, your team things, leaving events, trainings, etc. Wednesday, Friday, let's say you work from home, and everyone does the same pattern. Now, you may think it's inefficient on space. It is. You're not using your space on Wednesdays and Fridays. That's a cost of it, but then the upside is you're more productive, your employees are happy, and you don't have discrimination issues. Of course, if you're a really large firm, you can break things down by teams if the teams don't work that closely with each other. Imagine you have a corporate team and a residential team, saying they do different tasks, they don't work across the teams. One team could come in on Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, the other team could come in Wednesday, Friday on week 1, and then they could switch on week 2 and keep rotating. So that's the simple and the more complicated versions. But basically, people should come in the same number of days within a team each week and on the same days, and this should be planned in advance, because we have kids and spouses and work lives outside work, and we need to better plan these things. So we can't, for example, on Sunday night, the managers say, right, this week come in on Tuesdays and Thursdays. It's very hard to plan.
So that's a really interesting point, because I think all organizations at this point are trying to draft out their policies, and because nobody's been here before, everybody's sort of making a guess of what's going to work better. And as you spoke about, employees having preferences, so do leaders. There are leaders who seem very clear that they want everybody in office, and there are several leaders who say, they love the flexibility that they're able to give their employees, and they see that as a positive tool to retain talent as well, who seems to have expressed this preference. So I think that's a very, very clear guideline. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts around what kind of work would be better done in an office setting versus at home.
So great. So quickly on the leaders, what's interesting, by the way, is when I've spoken to CEOs and executives, even though in the media they get presented as having very opposite views sometimes, I don't think they're that far apart. So to give two extremes, David Solomon from Goldman Sachs said that working from home, in quote, was an aberration, quite explicitly said it. Whereas Mark Zuckerberg from Facebook, say last May, said Facebook would endorse and support working from home indefinitely. If you look at the actual text, and I haven't spoken to Goldman Sachs, I've spoken to Facebook, but if you look at what's actually implied, working from home can mean working from anything from 1 day a week to 5 days a week. And when David Solomon said working from home is an aberration, he meant 5 days a week. So in both cases, those statements are entirely consistent with going from 5 days a week now to 2 days a week post-pandemic. So most CEOs say that we are not going to continue with 5 days a week as we are now. We're also not going to go back to 0 days a week as we were before pandemic. Instead, we're going to, a third way, somewhere in the middle, which is 2 days a week. And that is, seems to be a pretty broad consensus. It's not going to be either extreme. As with most things in life, moderation is best. Working from home seems best in moderation, 2 days a week. So that's kind of the average. As in what tasks? In the US, and I could talk a bit about India and other countries, but in the US to start off with, if you look at the labor force, who's actually employed, roughly, it splits into two equal groups. So there's about 50% of people that can work from home reasonably well. They tend to be professionals, managers, people that basically whose workplace is an office. So there are people who are coming in, they're working with a computer. These types of people generally have tasks and they're doing jobs that can be done at home at least 2 days a week. And the stuff that you do at home tends to be quiet individual activity, report writing, reading, preparing presentations. The tasks that they need to do in the office are more creative and innovative activities. So working with others to design new ideas, basically forward-looking, more creative activities seem to be best done in the office because they involve other people doing, the same old existing tasks, particularly individualistic tasks, actually seem to be better done at home. Then there's the other half of the population who have more manual physical jobs or working with customers, say if you work in Starbucks, and that just can't be done at home. So for half the population, and my guess is, say in India, it's more like 25% of people that can easily work from home. And maybe like if you're in agriculture or manufacturing or basic service, the retail sector, you really can't work at home. And that's probably in India, maybe more like 75% of the population.
Right. So before we end our conversation today, Professor Bloom, what would you say are 2 or 3 guidelines that you would like to share with business leaders as they think about what form and shape to give hybrid in their organization?
So, if I go for, let's think of three tips. First tip is what's called mixed mode does not work. So mixed mode is when some people are in the office and some are at home on the same day. So if there's one message I've got from CEOs is that is a disaster. So, Sarah and Jane are at home and 5 other people in the office. And if you've ever been in the situation you're at home, you're dealing with a big Zoom and there's there's 2 screens, there's individual screens for people at home and there's one screen with lots of tiny heads of people in the office. You can see them looking away and moving and disappearing and making signals, and you're not part of the meeting. So one is mixed mode is horrible. Everyone should all be on one Zoom screen or team screen only. So that means it's better to have everyone either all in the office or all at home on the same day. So if for some reason some people are in the office and others are at home, those in the office have to connect through their own laptop, so they're on an equal footing. That's message 1.
Interesting.
Message 2 is it seems to work best having something like 2 days a week at home, 3 days a week in the office. So this is moderation. Some firms may come to slightly different views in the long run, but for sure, if I was a CEO now, I would announce we are looking at permanently doing 1 or 2 days a week at home to try and manage expectations. Otherwise, I worry. Get overexcited. They think it's going to be 5 days a week. They buy a house on the beach, 100 miles away, and then get very upset when you call them back to the office. And then thirdly, just in terms of timeline, again, I know the US both, most people are saying they're probably not going to start returning to the office until something like August, September. It depends a lot on vaccine rollout and infection rate. But even in the US, which is pretty advanced on vaccine rollout, most people are not thinking of returning to the office for another 6 months. But here, the view is probably that process will not be complete for another year from now. So the idea is when we do come back to the office, let's say in September, people come in for 1 day a week initially, but then go to 2 days a week and then 3 days a week. And by next spring, we'll be back up to full speed. Who can tell? COVID, like Brexit, one of these horror movies that seems to end, it keeps coming back. So this time next year, I may be back on your show talking about, 2027 when we're finally, and I hope not. This thing is just stretching on and on.
No, thank you. That's really, really helpful. I think I love the fact that you've given fairly concrete guidelines, because I know that all the leaders we speak to are trying to figure this one out. And there are so many views out there simply because none of us have been here before. And many people are also quite excited about the possibilities that this opens up for a much more remote talent, workforce, allowing people who don't live very close to the office to, still work for a particular organization. And even maybe perhaps recruiting people who are outside the geographical boundaries. But what you're saying is that what we're likely to see is something not that far apart from what we've experienced in the past. The big change will be that organizations will systematically allow policies of a few days of work from home across the board. And that's probably the likeliest model that we're going to see emerge as the pandemic ends.
Yes, I should end quickly by saying that's definitely true. What's interesting is I've done a lot of consulting with firms, and there are a number of firms in the US, UK, that are saying we are looking much more aggressively at offshoring, which for India could be a huge upside. And the kind of logic goes as follows. They say, look, we'd like people to come into the office 3 days a week, but we've also discovered that working fully remotely isn't that bad. So you may think, say, it's 80% as efficient to have a team 5 days remote as it is to come in the office. So if it's 80% efficient, it may actually be more cost effective to offshore, because if, say, the cost of running that group team in India is 50% and they're 80% efficient, that's a good deal, or in Mexico or anywhere else. So a lot of firms are saying, look, working from home fully remotely, look, it isn't perfect and would rather people come in. But if the alternative is fully remote, but in another country where it's substantially cheaper, we can easily live with that slight loss of efficiency. And particularly if the types of people we want to hire, we used to be able to hire, say Silicon Valley out of India, and it's no longer possible because of immigration. Trump initially, Brexit in the UK, travel restrictions because of COVID make it harder to bring the people to the jobs instead of bringing the jobs to the people. So there is a lot of discussion, and I think offshoring to India is just going to explode actually going forward. I think you're going to see an enormous increase in that, entirely driven by the success of working from home, B, anti-immigration policies in Europe and the US.
Now, interestingly, we're seeing that in India too. So, for instance, high-tech companies or organizations which recruit people with limited skills, as soon as the pandemic sort of was underway, they immediately opened out the recruitment process to people who were located anywhere, pretty much.
Right.
So, now having recruited, I don't see, that shifting all that quickly. So I think it's really open. There's been a huge psychological shift in what is possible remotely in the course of this year. So thank you, Professor. Sorry, go ahead. No, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. I loved reading your research, and I am going to share that along with this, on the event page for this. Also loved hearing your very, very specific guidelines, some of which are actually quite different from what we've been hearing largely around us. So appreciate it. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you very much.
Hi. So I hope you really enjoyed that. What Papia and I will now do is we'll just take some of the questions that have come in. I think some of the questions that were asked earlier in the chat happen to have been exactly the questions that Professor Bloom addressed, but we'll still sort of go over it so that we make sure that there aren't any questions left unaddressed that we actually know the answers for. As Professor Bloom himself said, we know some answers, and when I say we, I mean the world of ideas, academia, etc., etc. Some answers are known, and there are also many other unknowns which will just emerge over the next year or two. So we also don't want to overestimate how much is actually known. Yet what is known is going to be quite helpful for organizations which are planning their experiments, simply because, obviously the best way to design an experiment is by designing it well thought out, using insights and ideas that we already are fairly sure of, and then using those to design experiments. So with that, I'm going to start taking some of the questions on live, Papia, and then I'm going to hand it over to you and ask you to take some of the questions on the chat as well. So the first question I'll take. Hi, Ruben. Nice to see you here. Is there some framework or tool to assess willingness and opportunities for hybrid working? It's such a good question because I know all organizations are going to have to now figure this one out. So firstly, let's talk about the opportunities for hybrid working. Actually, there is a tool. It's about diagnosing the remote potential of different functions and different jobs. And the remote potential of different jobs, and Professor Bloom alluded to it, not as a tool, but just as a general idea. But as a tool, it means, understanding what amount of that work needs to happen in a collaborative fashion, what amount of work within that role or within that function can happen, parallelly, and people come together for, some parts of their jobs. different functions themselves can have different remote potentials, and we have already seen that in the experiences of organizations which have worked through the pandemic, where different functions have adopted different forms of remote working simply because they had no other choice. So if you were an essential services company, you needed teams which needed to be on the field or working in person, and yet they were within the same organization functions which moved remote. So there is that possibility, and particularly in large organizations, that might be one model that might emerge. So there is a framework. It's about assessing the remote potential of jobs and functions and using that to systematically decide what form of hybrid is helpful for the organization as a whole or for your function as a whole. And as I said, it's got about how much of your job can be digitized, how much needs to happen collaboratively, how much needs to happen synchronously, how much can happen asynchronously, and those are the kinds of questions it looks at. Is there a tool to assess willingness? Now, this is a really interesting one because it refers to the big dilemma, which we spoke about in the earlier conversation as well. The dilemma is that absolutely people differ in their willingness to how much do they want to work in office versus how much they want to work at home. Yet at the same time, one of the troubling findings that this study throws up is that if we were to offer that kind of flexibility, we need to understand what might be some of the implications of that down the road. The fact that call center work is there are tight metrics for it, so you can actually count productivity per hour, and even when adjusted for productivity, employees who had spent more time in the office got promoted more. And as Professor Bloom said, the people who opt to work in office very often tend to be young, college-educated men. They have the strongest preference. So there are implications for diversity there. There are implications for inclusion. So, the whole process of designing the hybrid workplace isn't just as, it would be too simplistic to think it's just about, remote potential of a job and how does that divide up for the organization or for different functions or for different individuals. There are all these implications that we sort of have to work into the discussion of, if we were to offer flexibility, what kind of organization will emerge? And if we don't offer that flexibility, what will be the implications? Because there are some implications either way, given the fact that, as Professor Bloom's big research suggests, there are 25% on both sides and 50% in the middle. And another piece of work, which actually he has done, suggests there's a monetary value that employees associate with the perk of flexible working. So a lot of people want that. And how does that get distributed? There are some implications to the form and choices of hybrid that get designed. The next comment, very interesting topic. Wonder if there's a quantified estimate of the dollar value of increased responsiveness when high-tech folks work from home and for longer hours. I'm sure there will be a study on this which will get published, say, next year. Just knowing the way research and academia work, it takes time. And I'm sure there are many, many people who over the last year and a half have been trying to put the numbers together so that they're going to have cutting edge, which will come out. It has not come out as yet. Let me share that. We are always on top of, important ideas, important research. So it hasn't emerged just as yet, but I think it's just around the corner, simply because it's a topic I think many, many organizations are very, very curious about. I think organizations internally may have some metrics, but they aren't in the public domain as yet. Parul, we suddenly felt that the talent pool opened up across the globe. How does hybrid work model affect that, and how can we explore this? I think that's a great question, and it is a reality. One of the blockchain technology organizations I work with, for instance, use this opportunity to hire people from many other geographies than they would have otherwise, because their work is largely digitized. And in their way of working, it is possible for them to work for long periods of time remotely and then come together for, some time to build that kind of connection and relationships, which is also important in this process. I think it'll be quite interesting because it does open out talent pools, not just actually within India, but across geographies outside of India as well. And there could be many other interesting talent pools, even affordable talent pools outside of India that I think many organizations might be open to exploring. So one of the things that the pandemic has certainly done is that it's broken a psychological barrier, and that psychological barrier, it's a huge one. That's why so many organizations are now willing to try out, okay, what will happen if we hire, say, a talent pool in, say, Romania or another country where they have the kind of talent that they're looking for. So we are going to see that a number of people, not just Professor Bloom, but many other academics I've been speaking to, have been speaking about how they expect that the movement towards offshoring actually might increase, whether to India or whichever location, simply because now the work doesn't, people don't have to travel for work and the work can travel to them. So it has opened up possibilities much stronger than maybe just before the pandemic.
Sally, I would like to add
Yeah, go ahead.
here. I think, Parul, there are two pieces. One is that how are we managing the hybrid for our own staff or the regular employed staff in the organized sector. We are also seeing a huge rise that is happening for the gig workers. And most of the organizations are quite okay to have the gig workers completely remote. We are talking about in India 130 million people working in gig, and most of these workers are completely remote. They're managing on their own. And the same when we are looking at all the freelancing sites that you will be going in, you will find that there are more and more opportunities that are coming for global organizations which are now open to have their gig workforce coming from any part of the world. So we see that talent pool for complete remote increasing through the gig workforce.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. No, absolutely true. And actually, if you've been following the show, we've done quite a few episodes on rise of flexible work, rise of gig work globally, and what's happening in the United States, what's happening globally, what's happening in India, because this is a huge trend. And it integrates very well with flexible working. So, we are going to see the two trends go parallelly in many, many organizations. The next question. Interesting notion that folks present in the office, irrespective of business results or impact, will progress more. Absolutely right. It's also one that's quite troubling because, for instance, it's something which leaders and managers will need to be conscious of. And particularly if it's, there's a difference within the same team and similar roles, because, then there are points of comparison. One of the things, in fact, in the program which we've created with Harappa, these are the kinds of things which we try and help managers become conscious of, because they are realities. And I'm pretty sure that the people who aren't getting promoted, their managers are not consciously doing that. But just because, we're human, we are fairly fallible and out of sight, out of mind. But that's something to be conscious of. It also makes us give pause to the fact that some organizations whom I've met in the last few weeks have spoken about completely flexible working, where every manager, for instance, might choose a different form of hybrid. So, there are all these implications that I think one will need to think through, because it's not as simple as that. The behavior that the leader role models, for instance, on what exactly is acceptable in such circumstances has huge cultural significance. And I'll take maybe two more, Papia, then I'll hand some of these questions to you. Ajay, thanks for joining. Hybrid work would vary from industry to industry. Absolutely, creative work needs office working. First part, absolutely, industry to industry. We're likely to see that the nature of work is different. The remote potential of different work is different. About whether creative work needs office working, there are two possibilities. When it is creative collaboration, it's much easier to do in office. There's no question about it. It's more natural, for instance, sitting in a room together, etc., etc. It can be done remotely as well, but it's just a little bit harder to do. On the other hand, actually about 10 days ago, I was speaking to somebody who works in a very, very creative organization, which actually produces movies. And they also spoke about, however, thanks to this experience, they are now open to hiring people who are, say, writers, writing, say, about, say, Madhya Pradesh, some story set in MP, and they're sitting in a small town in MP. They're open to those kind of collaborations, whereas earlier those people may not have even come under their radar. So they're able to now think about, okay, let's search for people who really understand that ethos better and can write stories for us from those places. So I think even for creative work, we'll see it play out probably differently. Wherever there's a large element of collaboration, it'll be so much more helpful to be in office. But where, like writing is, a solo activity in large part, it's a asynchronous. You can do a piece of writing and share it with somebody else, get feedback, etc. So it doesn't have to be while you're sitting in the room together. That kind of work might actually prosper. So we are perhaps going to see a bit of both. And also your comment on mixed mode is horrible. I think it is true. It's really hard to do justice to. I think it's inevitable because very often we aren't going to have everybody in the same room, and we will have part of our team in different parts of the city, country, whatever. But it is complex, and therefore, Professor Bloom's suggestion was that if that's going to be the case, then everybody should log on to the same platform, so that there isn't an inherent advantage to those who happen to be in office that day. So there are all these finer points that being conscious of will help leaders and HR professionals design their hybrid workplace much better. With that, Papia, can I request you to take some of the questions which are on our LinkedIn event chat?
So I'll start with Ritu Shinha. She has put in quite a few comments and questions. I have a question around how organizations planning to help and support managers more than they are doing now to better deal with DEI challenges, DNI challenges that hybrid work arrangements will bring forth. Ritu, I think the DNI conversation is a very, very hot conversation now, because DNI is no more generally, only about gender. It is now about generations. It is about age group. It is about the kind of choices people are making about their lifestyle. So we are bound, when we are looking at employee experience, it is becoming quite natural and almost mandatory for all the organizations to look at DEI very separately. And we do hope that the emphasis on looking at the DEI challenges and addressing them increases over the period of time. But we are seeing the natural intent that is there to look at what kind of challenges that are coming in. And with the hybrid, I think what we heard from Dr. Bloom is that we might not be able to bring in differentiation based on the DI. At least that is not suggested, because that looks at some kind of a discrimination coming in. So when we are looking at specific to hybrid, I think there has to be some fundamental policies that needs to be defined. And when the policies are defined, everybody is looked through the similar glass and there is no discrimination that is coming in.
I'll just add one thing, because this is a very important issue. And I see there are more questions as well on this. Ravi, thanks for joining, Ravi Kingrani. It is going to be quite a challenge, because on the one hand, flexibility of work is something that a lot of women do look forward to, and it helps them integrate, the different elements of their life. On the other hand, if it is the case that, if you're working remotely for long, your chances of promotion are going to be impacted, then there are two possibilities. One is that at a managerial policy level, you become much, much more conscious and strategic. And, for instance, some organizations do that with maternity leave, that their performance appraisal in the maternity leave is not impacted because they were on leave. So, it requires then you becoming conscious of the fact that if we were not to create or specifically articulate anything, they will suffer. So now we are going to specifically articulate and say, okay, let's look at outcomes first. and then anything else. So that's one route it can take, that, you use that flexibility to make life easier for many people, but then layer that flexibility with a lot more consciousness that you are in fact being outcome focused, and you are in fact offering coaching and mentoring just the way you would with someone who is present in office a lot more. Or the other option is, if that isn't your organization's cup of tea, that you say, okay, we will do away with that by saying, okay, it is the same across the board. In our team, or, our part of the organization, everyone works whatever, Monday, Thursday, Friday, and that's that. So, and you arrive at that by having some kind of, conversation with enough people to see, what's the medium path that will work best for most of the people in your organization. So it is a pretty tricky part, particularly in India, because this pandemic has been terrible for, women in India. So many women have lost their jobs over the last year as organizations have downsized. Our labor force participation has dropped significantly. So it's going to be a very, very tricky, no simple answers here, but lots of things to be conscious of as we design this. Sorry for jumping in.
No. So I think the second question from Sunil Sa, though the future belongs to hybrid working, some issues need to be addressed, like dilution of culture, the impact of culture as the workforce becomes dispersed. Remote workers may end up getting lower performance evaluations, smaller raises, and fewer promotion than their colleagues in office. Seamless connectivity with those working remotely are not effortlessly connected with those in office, and there will inevitably the disparities, silos, and the knowledge loss. Sunil, absolute relevant points, and what we heard today in the conversations were very much similar in the line that when moving to hybrid is not going to be very easy. It is not like a one size fits all approach that will be, and we have to be very, very clear about and conscious about what kind of a discrimination might come in, because it is a human nature that we like people whom we see working. It is not only the outcome based, because it's quite naturally most of the organizations are becoming more outcome focused, and that has come out of remote, where we have started, where it is becoming more and more important to be outcome focused. But there is a human need to see the people working, and quite naturally the people who are working remote for longer might have some disadvantage because of that. So organizations will have to work in, and it is not just a policy. It is not just about technology. It is about looking at how do we build the overall organizational culture. And organizational culture for hybrid, I think, needs to be thought through, and employee experience needs to be accounted for with whole employee participation, and then going on in defining what is the culture that we need to build. So there is a lot of work that requires to be done to rethink the way we are going to build the culture for hybrid.
Yeah, I think very well said. See, for organizations, as you move to hybrid, just be conscious of the fact that it's not just about, designing how many days to come into office or not. That's certainly important, and it's an important starting point. But there is a mindset shift which is needed for all of that to come together well for you, to bring out the best in people. And there are some very specific elements to the kind of mindset shift that will be needed. For instance, just as an example, it needs far greater training or consciousness of outcome assessment, because that's really going to be critical. At the same time, you need far more strategic clarity within the team on, who's doing what, why, how are different people, contributing. You need much greater levels of trust, because you need to be able to then give people the flexibility to organize their work in a way that works best for their own productivity. So there are all these mindset shifts that are going to be quite important when you introduced hybrid. And just as Papia said, we are finding this troubling outcome that people who aren't in office as much and don't have as much face time, their career progression, without any level of consciousness, it will suffer. So what do we do then to compensate for all of that? So it is a much larger cultural conversation than just designing, how many days in office and how many days working from home. I also realized we're on the hour, Papia. So shall we take one last question? And
so there is one interesting observation. Says Uncube should do a survey to assess the state of affair in Indian companies struggling to implement the hybrid model. I don't have the name, but I think this is a very, very good suggestion. And some of it we have done. Actually, beginning of the year, this year, we conducted a study around hybrid working, which had more than 40 organizations participating. We spoke to 100 leaders, and we had done survey, which was participation around 1,000 people. And some of the hybrid challenges that we came through, we were quite happy to see that similar points were raised by Dr. Bloom today in his conversations. So we found that there was quite a bit of a similarity between what he has found and what our survey revealed in the Indian context.
yeah, thanks, Manvi. This is Manvi's question. Now, before we leave, just one last, because this question is so, interesting. So one more consideration on employee bonding with an organization. Any insights on this relative to attrition? So see, here's the really interesting finding. The finding from this experiment was that attrition became half. And attrition became half because people found it so much easier to integrate into their lives. We're also seeing that because people are valuing flexibility as a perk. That means that, when they're deciding between two organizations, this might in the future become one of the factors which they use to consider. We are likely to see that, employees are going to be more and more drawn towards organizations which offer some form of flexible working. Yet at the same time, it's much easier to build connections meeting in person. That is also true. So there is a balance of both that, how do we use in-person office days for a lot of what we call, intensely human interactions, whether those human interactions are things like collaborative brainstorming, learning from each other, sharing experience, or whether they are just the, let's go for a chat and have coffee together and get to know each other beyond the task. And that's also a very, very important consideration in the way, a good hybrid model can work. So with that, Papi, I realized we're on the hour. We ran out of time. I hope all of you really enjoyed our conversation. I think the hybrid workplace is going to be a very, very interesting learning experience for all of us. There are some things we know already, and I think it makes a lot of sense to integrate those findings, those ideas, those pieces of understanding, those tools and frameworks in the process of your designing your hybrid workplace. But there's also the reality that there'll be much, much more that's going to emerge over the next 1 year. So with that, thank you all very much for joining in. Do stay tuned. We will have very soon what we called an Uncube Unplugged, where Papia and I will answer many of your questions. And this time the topic is going to be on the future of careers. So with that, thanks very much for joining us. Have a great weekend. Bye for now.
Thank you.